An otherworldly sound echoes through the October night across the Korean mountains. A low moan that seems to rise from the depths of hell itself, like some kind of satanic milk cow. Wondering what could be responsible for the eerie wail, Private First Class James Yarborough looks out over the unforgiving landscape from his position on the hook, a thumb-shaped piece of high ground that juts out like a target, exposed on three sides, which he and his fellow Marines face the near impossible task of defending. If the hook falls, Communist forces would have a clear path to Seoul, just 50 miles to the south. The capture of South Korea's capital would collapse the entire UN defense line, force a humiliating American retreat, and hand the Communists total victory in the Korean War. Suddenly, Yarborough identifies the source of the strange sound. The battle horns of thousands of Chinese troops now swarming towards him. The fate of the free world now depends on a few hundred Marines on a godforsaken Korean hillside. Amassing forces. In late September 1952, Major General Edwin A. Pollock stood in his command bunker at the 1st Marine Division headquarters, studying the tactical map spread across the table before him. Blue symbols showed his own forces, 25,000 Marines scattered across the extreme left flank of the Jamestown Line, the United Nations' main line of resistance across the Korean peninsula. Under orders from the U.S. 8th Army, Pollock's entire division had been relocated from Korea's east-central sector to this western front, a massive logistical undertaking completed in March 1952. Now, they'd been given a staggering responsibility, defending 32 miles of strategically vital terrain that stretched across western Korea just north of the 38th parallel, the original border between North and South Korea. Meanwhile, the red symbols on his map represented the enemy. The Chinese People's Volunteer Army had positioned the 65th and 63rd Armies opposite his Marines, a combined force of nearly 50,000 troops who had been steadily reinforcing their positions throughout the summer and fall. These weren't the same inexperienced Chinese forces that had first crossed the Yalu River when they entered the war in 1950. The PVA had learned hard lessons from 2 years of fighting American forces, adapting their tactics and building a formidable artillery arm with 10 full battalions of guns, ranging from 75mm field pieces to massive 152mm howitzers. Aerial reconnaissance revealed extensive tunnel networks and fortified positions carved deep into the hillsides. The Chinese had been stockpiling ammunition and supplies for months. As Pollock reviewed the latest intelligence photographs, one conclusion was inescapable. The enemy was preparing for a major offensive. Setting down the photographs, Pollock knew that a confrontation was inevitable. The question wasn't whether the Chinese would attack. It was when, where, and in what strength. The hook. Of all the terrain features along Pollock's 32-mile front, none concerned him more than a piece of high ground that jutted out from the Jamestown line like a giant thumb. The Marines called it the hook, and as Pollock studied his maps that late September evening, he knew this single piece of terrain could determine the fate of the entire war. His superior, General Lemuel C. Shepard, Commandant of the entire U.S. Marine Corps, had already identified the hook as both crucial and problematic during his visit to Korea, and it seemed his assessment would be proven all too accurate. The hook dominated the vital approaches to the Samechon Valley, commanding a view that stretched for miles in every direction. If the Chinese managed to seize it, enemy forces could march unhindered all the way to Seoul, South Korea's capital, just 50 miles to the south. The fall of Seoul would be a propaganda disaster that could shift the entire trajectory of the Korean War. Even worse, the hook's capture would create a corridor for outflanking the entire United Nations position, potentially cutting off American forces from their British Commonwealth allies and forcing a retreat of 2 miles or more to find defensible terrain. The terrain surrounding the hook was a defender's nightmare. Deep valleys and knife-edge ridges channeled attacking forces toward the American entrenchments, while making it nearly impossible to provide mutual support between defensive strongpoints. It was the kind of vulnerable salient that military tacticians warned against, one that could be attacked from 3 sides simultaneously. In early October 1952, the responsibility for defending this cursed piece of ground fell to Colonel Thomas C. Moore Jr.'s 7th Marine Regiment as they relieved the 5th Marines along the Jamestown line. Moore's regiment inherited 7 existing outposts, which they renamed after cities: Carson, Reno, Vegas, Berlin, Detroit, Frisco, and Seattle, stretching from left to right across their sector. In addition, the 7th Marines established 2 new outposts, Warsaw and Verdun. 4 of the outposts, Detroit, Frisco, Seattle, and Warsaw, were particularly vulnerable. Separated by an average of only 450 yards, they occupied lower ground than the positions on the left side of the regimental sector. This made them easier for the Chinese to isolate and attack, turning each outpost into a potential death trap for the Marines manning them. The 3rd Battalion found themselves responsible for the most exposed positions, including the newly established Warsaw, which guarded the perilous approaches to the Hook itself. Facing the Marines across this forbidding landscape were elements of the Chinese 356th and 357th Regiments from the 119th Division, approximately 7,000 battle-hardened troops, supported by those 10 battalions of artillery which so concerned General Pollock. As October's chill settled over the Korean mountains, Chinese artillery began ranging in on the vulnerable Marine outposts, each round a harbinger of the storm to come. First Blood. On the night of October 2nd, 1952, the Chinese People's Volunteer Army struck with devastating force and a carefully orchestrated plan. Artillery pounded the American positions, while PVA infantry companies moved through the valleys under cover of darkness, their approach masked by the thunder of exploding shells. As the barrage lifted, hundreds of Chinese soldiers swarmed toward the isolated Marine outposts at Seattle and Warsaw, their battle cries echoing across the ridgelines. At Outpost Warsaw, 18-year-old Private Jack W. Kelso manned a bunker with 4 other Marines from the 3rd Battalion's Company 1. The young Marine was far from his family's farm in Madera, California, where he'd worked alongside his father until enlisting in the Corps at just 17. Already a combat veteran despite his youth, Kelso had earned the Silver Star just 2 months earlier for making 20 trips through enemy fire to carry ammunition to besieged Marines on a distant hill. Now, as Chinese forces overwhelmed Warsaw's perimeter defenses, he faced his ultimate test. The attack on Warsaw was swift and brutal. Chinese infantry penetrated the defensive wire and fought their way into the Marine trenches, engaging the defenders in savage hand-to-hand combat. In the chaos of the night battle, with muzzle flashes lighting up confused scenes of desperate fighting, both the platoon commander and platoon sergeant became casualties, leaving the Marines without clear leadership. Then, disaster struck Kelso's bunker. A Chinese grenade landed among the 5 Marines huddled inside their fortified position. Without hesitation, the teenage Marine grabbed the projectile and hurled it back at the advancing enemy troops. The grenade exploded as it left his hand, shredding his arm with hot metal fragments and inflicting painful wounds that would have sent most men to the ground. But Kelso wasn't finished. Despite his injuries, he moved out into the fire-swept area and continued firing at the enemy, providing covering fire that allowed his 4 fellow Marines to escape the bunker and reach the relative safety of the main trench line. The teenage farm boy from California held his position, trading shots with enemy soldiers in the darkness until Chinese bullets found their mark. Yet he could only hold out for so long. Kelso fell at his post, still facing the enemy. His sacrifice had bought precious time and saved the lives of his comrades, earning him a posthumous Medal of Honor. However, even Kelso's heroic acts could not save Warsaw. The outpost fell to overwhelming numbers, and only 3 Marines from the entire garrison would survive the communist assault. Outpost Seattle fell the same night, its defenders overwhelmed by superior numbers. Though the Americans mounted counterattacks over the next 2 days, Chinese artillery superiority made retaking the outpost impossible. The Marines were forced to accept the bitter reality. 2 of their forward positions were now in enemy hands. The battle intensifies. The losses of Warsaw and Seattle was only the beginning. Over the next 5 days, the Chinese People's Volunteer Army maintained relentless pressure on the Marine outposts, probing for weaknesses and launching coordinated attacks designed to strip away the 7th Marines' forward defenses one by one. Company 1's commander, Captain John H. Thomas, refused to accept the loss of his positions without a fight. On the morning of October 3rd, Thomas mounted a desperate counterattack against Seattle, sending 2 squads from his company forward under a smokescreen laid down by Marine aircraft and artillery. Despite the covering fire, his Marines found the outpost too strongly held by Chinese forces. The counterattack stalled short of the objective as enemy artillery pounded the advancing Americans. Thomas was forced to break off the assault after losing more men he could ill afford. That evening, as dusk settled, the Marines tried again. 2 squads resumed the attack on Seattle, reinforced by a 3rd squad from the 1st Battalion's Company A that had been placed under the 3rd Battalion's operational control. But the Chinese defenders proved tenacious, clinging to their newly won positions and inflicting casualties that steadily sapped the strength of the Marine assault. After hours of bitter fighting, Seattle remained in enemy hands. The casualties were mounting at an alarming rate. By the end of October 3rd, the 3rd Battalion had suffered 13 losses and 88 wounded in their attempts to retake the lost outposts. This forced Colonel Moore to reorganize his entire regiment. The 3rd Battalion, badly mauled by 3 days of continuous fighting, had to reduce its frontage and consolidate its remaining strength. To fill the gap, Moore moved Lieutenant Colonel Leo J. Dulacky's 1st Battalion from the Regimental Reserve to take over the critical right-hand portion of the Jamestown line. Dulacky was no stranger to desperate situations. The Polish-American officer had survived the sinking of USS Hornet during the World War II Battle of Santa Cruz, and later served in intelligence roles in Moscow and Helsinki during the tense years of the early Cold War, giving him an insight into the communist mindset that few other American officers possessed. Now, as his Marines took responsibility for the Hook itself and the remaining outposts of Warsaw and Verdun, Dulacky quickly assessed the tactical nightmare he had inherited. The Chinese held the high ground at Seattle. They had proven their willingness to accept heavy casualties, and intelligence reports suggested they were preparing for an even larger offensive. The brief lull in fighting on October 4th and 5th gave Dulacky time to position his forces. Box me in. By dawn on October 6th, a reinforced platoon of Marines from Company C was ready to make another advance toward Seattle. Mortar and artillery fire forced them to take cover and regroup, but they resumed the assault at 9 a.m. with infantry reinforcements, airstrikes, and artillery support. Despite their best efforts, the Marines could not crack Seattle's defenses and broke off the attack 2 hours later, with 12 fatalities and 44 wounded. That evening, the Chinese took the initiative. The most determined attacks hit outposts Detroit and Frisco in the center of the regimental front. Each position was manned by just 2 squads of Marines, about 30 men facing hundreds of attacking Chinese soldiers. At Detroit, the Chinese company gained a foothold in the main trench at 7:40 p.m., but was driven back by defensive fire. 2 hours later, they seized another segment of trench and tried to exploit their success, forcing the Marines to call for box-me-in artillery fire that would shell around their own position to stop the Chinese advance. When communications failed, the Marines at Detroit requested variable-time artillery fire, shells that would burst in the air above the bunkers, protecting the Americans below, while exposing the Chinese attackers to a lethal rain of metal fragments. But this respite proved short-lived. The Chinese renewed their attack shortly after midnight, and this time they extended their control over the hill, despite further Marine losses to artillery. By 3:55 a.m., a 6-man Marine patrol sent to check on the outpost returned with devastating news. The Chinese now held the trenches and bunkers, and only 2 of the Marines who had originally manned Detroit had escaped. The rest had either fallen in battle or been captured. The struggle for Frisco. At the same time as the assault on Detroit, at Outpost Frisco, a Chinese company hit the 2 Marine squads from Company H around 8 p.m., working their way into the trenches before being driven back by a combination of small arms fire and artillery airbursts. Just after midnight, the Chinese renewed their attack with greater intensity, and 2 Marine squads advanced from the main line to reinforce Frisco, only to be stopped short by enemy fire. It was during this final assault on Frisco that Staff Sergeant Louis G. Watkins, a former police officer from Seneca, South Carolina, wrote his name in Marine Corps legend. The 27-year-old had been wounded earlier in the fighting, but refused evacuation, instead obtaining an automatic rifle from an injured Marine and using it to pin down an enemy machine gun that was holding up the assault. As Watkins and several other Marines moved forward through the trenches toward the Chinese positions, a grenade landed among them. Without hesitation, Watkins pushed his companions aside and attempted to throw the projectile back at the enemy. However, the grenade exploded in his hand before he could release it, taking his life, but saving those of the Marines around him. Watkins' sacrifice contributed to Company 1 finally breaking through and securing Frisco at 7:15 a.m. on October 7th. Like Jack Kelso 5 days earlier, the former police officer had given his life to save his fellow Marines, and he too would be posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor for his selfless courage under fire. Nonetheless, the cost of holding these exposed positions was becoming unbearable. To keep Frisco in Marine hands would require more men than Division Commander General Pollock and Colonel Moore could spare from the main line of resistance. The regiment already had 10 fatalities, 22 missing, and 128 wounded, 105 of them seriously enough to require evacuation. The Chinese had paid a heavy price too, with an estimated 200 lives lost, but they seemed to have an endless supply of replacements. Faced with these harsh realities, the 7th Marines made the painful decision to abandon Frisco. Combined with the earlier losses of Detroit and Seattle, plus 3 outposts taken from the Korean Marine Corps, the Marines had now yielded 6 forward positions to the enemy. The outer ring of defenses was gone, but the Chinese had only begun to reveal their true intentions. $34,000 rounds. After seizing the outer ring of Marine outposts, the Chinese forces seemed to vanish into the Korean hills. For more than 2 weeks, an ominous quiet settled over the Jamestown line. Patrols probed through the darkness, occasional sniper fire cracked across the valleys, but the major assaults had stopped. The Marines used this lull to reorganize their defenses and prepare for what everyone knew was coming. The 5th Marines took over the center of the division's line, allowing the 1st Marine Regiment to move into reserve. Colonel Moore's 7th Marines now held the critical right flank, with all 3 battalions stretched along the main line of resistance. Lieutenant Colonel Dulaki's 1st Battalion remained responsible for the Hook itself, the vital terrain feature that dominated the Samachan Valley approaches to Seoul. Dulaki established a new combat position called Ronson, named after a Ronson lighter that one of the Marines had misplaced there during a night patrol. Located 275 yards west of the Hook and 200 yards southeast of the Chinese-held Seattle, Ronson would guard the western approaches, while Warsaw commanded the eastern valley. The Marines knew these lonely replacement outposts would bear the brunt of whatever the Chinese were planning. Soon, during the last week of October, the enemy revealed their intentions. Chinese artillery batteries, carefully positioned within range of the Hook, began a systematic bombardment that dwarfed anything the Marines had previously experienced. Between dusk on October 24th and dawn on the 25th, an estimated 1,200 artillery rounds exploded among the trenches and bunkers on the Hook and its 2 remaining outposts. The Marines and their Korean Service Corps laborers worked frantically to repair the damage, shoring up collapsed trenches and reinforcing shattered bunkers during brief lulls in the bombardment, only to watch their work destroyed when the shelling resumed. Marine artillery fired back when ammunition supplies allowed. The 2nd Battalion, 11th Marines, managed 400 rounds from their 105mm guns on the first day, but the Chinese batteries vastly outnumbered their American counterparts. On October 25th, Lieutenant Colonel Dulaki took advantage of a temporary lull to personally inspect his battered defenses. As he moved along the trench line, a Chinese shell exploded nearby, the concussion knocking him to the ground. Unfazed, Dulaki picked himself up, checked for serious injuries, and continued his inspection. Nevertheless, the message was clear. If the battalion commander wasn't safe anywhere on the Hook, nobody was. The bombardment intensified on October 26th. By evening, the Chinese had fired over 34,000 artillery and mortar rounds at the Hook and its outposts. As darkness fell, Marine lookouts reported movement in the valleys below. The softening up phase was over. Overrun. At 7 p.m. on October 26th, the Chinese launched a coordinated assault across multiple targets. Infantry stormed Outpost Ronson after 3 days of relentless bombardment that had collapsed trenches and shattered bunkers. The 50-man assault force, penetrated the defensive artillery concentrations and swarmed over the position. The reinforced Marine squad manning the outpost fought desperately, but they were overwhelmed by sheer numbers. Any survivors were taken prisoner. Simultaneously, a full Chinese company split into two groups and attacked Outpost Ronson from both east and west. Lieutenant John Babson's Marines called for more box-me-in fire. Despite thousands of shells exploding just outside their perimeter, the Chinese assault troops broke through. The fighting at Ronson devolved into savage hand-to-hand combat. Marines fought with grenades, pistols, and rifles, using their weapons as clubs when ammunition ran out. Taking cover in the wreckage of their bunkers, they called for variable time artillery fire directly overhead. After 4 hours of desperate fighting, radio contact with Ronson was lost. Only 3 Marines survived the communist assault. While the outposts fell, an even larger disaster was unfolding at the Hook itself. Under cover of the same devastating artillery barrage, a full Chinese battalion launched a 3-pronged attack on Lieutenant Colonel Dulaki's main position, converging on the Hook from multiple directions simultaneously. Private First Class James Yarborough, fighting with Company C on the main line, watched in horror as the enemy swarmed toward his position, recalling, quote, "They were coming over the ridge, gangs of them yelling and blowing horns. They had a horn that sounded like a milk cow. We couldn't get our guns to work, and we only had 2 hand grenades. I threw one, and my buddy had the pin pulled and was ready to throw the other when he got hit. I threw it." Among the assault troops were laborers carrying construction materials. The Chinese intended to fortify the Hook immediately after capturing it. The attack along the ridge continued until the enemy encountered the observation post, where 2nd Lieutenant Sherrod E. Skinner Jr. was directing Marine artillery fire. The 25-year-old lieutenant organized a desperate defense of his bunker, running through enemy fire to replenish ammunition supplies, while continuing to call down devastating artillery strikes on the attackers. When the Chinese finally overran his position, Skinner ordered his men to play dead. For 3 hours, they successfully fooled the enemy soldiers who entered the bunker. Finally, a suspicious Chinese soldier threw a grenade inside. Without hesitation, Skinner rolled onto the explosive device, heroically absorbing the full force of the blast with his own body and saving the lives of 2 of his comrades. He would be posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, joining Jack Kelso and Lewis Watkins in receiving this honor. The counterattack. By dawn on October 27th, the Hook was in Chinese hands. After 36 hours of continuous fighting, the Marines had been driven from the most strategically important piece of terrain on their entire front. The road to Seoul lay open. As the morning light revealed the full extent of the disaster, Colonel Moore faced the most critical decision of his career. The Chinese now controlled a 400-yard gap in the Jamestown line, with scattered groups of Marines struggling to form defensive perimeters on either side of the captured Hook. If the enemy consolidated their gains and brought up reinforcements, the entire UN position could collapse. Moore had no choice but to commit his last reserves. At 3 a.m., he ordered Company H from the 3rd Battalion to join the desperate fight. General Pollock, recognizing the crisis, released the 3rd Battalion 1st Marines from Division Reserve. The counterattack to retake the Hook would require everything the Marines could muster. The first assault began at dawn, when Company A, 1st Battalion, attempted to advance toward the Hook. Chinese mortar and artillery fire immediately pinned them down, forcing the Marines to dig in, short of their objective. The enemy had used the night hours well, consolidating their positions and bringing up additional ammunition and reinforcements. At 5:05 a.m., Lieutenant Colonel Dulaki ordered Company H to renew the attack. Captain Bernard Ballant's Marines slowly worked their way forward, but as they approached the Hook, Chinese artillery and small arms fire intensified dramatically. Leading the assault was 2nd Lieutenant George H. O'Brien, Jr., a 26-year-old geology graduate from Texas Tech who had been commissioned just the year before. O'Brien led his platoon over the ridge toward the Chinese-held trench line, his men zigzagging as they ran through a hail of gunfire. A bullet struck his armored vest, slamming him to the ground, but the young lieutenant scrambled to his feet and continued the assault. Pausing only to help a wounded Marine, O'Brien threw grenades into enemy bunkers and engaged Chinese soldiers in hand-to-hand combat, personally eliminating at least 3 enemy troops. 3 times, concussive grenades knocked O'Brien down. 3 times he got back up, refusing medical treatment continuing to lead his men forward. For 4 grueling hours, his platoon held their advanced position against repeated Chinese counterattacks, with O'Brien constantly moving among his men, encouraging them and directing their fire. The assault broke through the Chinese perimeter and reached the southeastern portion of the Hook, before fierce shelling forced the Marines to take cover. Though they couldn't advance further, O'Brien's heroic charge had cracked the enemy's defenses. More importantly, it had been shown that the Hook could be retaken. O'Brien would become the 4th Marine to receive the Medal of Honor for his actions at the Hook in October 1952, and the only one who lived to collect the award. He would later say, quote, "This medal's not mine. It belongs to those kids who never grew up to be grandfathers. It's in trust, and I hope I wear it well." The final push. At midday on October 27th, General Pollock released Company 1, 3rd Battalion, 1st Marines to Colonel Moore's control. Company 1 would drive the Chinese onto the Hook, after which Company B would make the decisive assault to recapture both the strategic high ground and the lost outposts of Warsaw. Company 1 launched their attack in the early afternoon, with the 1st Platoon seizing the crest of the ridge at 1:50 p.m. before advancing toward the Hook behind a devastating barrage from the 11th Marines. The Chinese responded with their own artillery and mortar concentration, targeting not only the advancing Marines, but also Colonel Moore's command post and the weapons positions along the Jamestown line that supported the assault. Despite severe casualties, Company 1 pushed ahead through the shell-torn landscape, at times crawling from one crater to another through the hail of high-angle fire. After pausing to reorganize, the company moved onto the Hook itself, a few men at a time, engaging Chinese soldiers who were fighting from collapsed bunkers and devastated trenches. By midnight on October 28th, Company B had threaded its way through the maze of shell craters and moved into position behind Company 1. Shortly afterward, they began what Lieutenant Colonel Dulacki had planned as the final assault on the Hook. Small arms fire and a shower of grenades from the Chinese positions met the Marines as they attacked with rifles and grenades of their own. After exchanging fire with the enemy for 90 minutes, Company B fell back to obtain cover and called for mortar and artillery fire. The Marine gunners battered the Chinese strongpoints, their supporting weapons, and the supply routes that passed through the enemy-held outposts of Warsaw and Ronson. The Marines renewed their assault, broke through the weakened Chinese defenses, and by 6 a.m. had completely overrun the Hook. Elements of the 7th Marines then reoccupied Warsaw and Reno, which the Chinese had abandoned during their retreat. As dense fog settled over the Hook, Dulacki's Marines neutralized or captured the remaining Chinese stragglers and began reorganizing their shattered defenders. Only the beginning. The cost of the battle had been enormous, with large numbers of casualties on both sides. But the strategic victory belonged unmistakably to the Marines. The successful defense of the Hook had far-reaching consequences that extended well beyond the immediate tactical situation. Seoul remained secure, the Jamestown line held firm, and Chinese hopes of achieving a major breakthrough on the Western Front were decisively crushed. The battle demonstrated that even with overwhelming numerical superiority and massive artillery support, the People's Volunteer Army could not dislodge determined American defenders from key terrain when those defenders were willing to pay the ultimate price. But this epic battle would be only the beginning of the struggle for this strategic terrain. Following the Marine victory, the 29th British Infantry Brigade of the 1st Commonwealth Division took over responsibility for defending the position. The Chinese, unwilling to accept their defeat, renewed their attacks in the Second Battle of the Hook on November 18th and 19th, 1952. British and Commonwealth forces would face repeated assaults during the winter and spring of 1953, including a final major offensive in May, just weeks before the armistice that ended active hostilities. Each successive battle for the Hook confirmed what the Marines had proven in October 1952.